The dust rose in golden clouds as 3 cowboys circled the woman in black. Their laughter died when she moved. The first shot shattered the evening air. The second followed before the echo faded. The third punctuated what the first 2 had begun. 2 men dropped to the dirt of Red Hollow's main street, clutching wounds that would not kill but would remind them forever. The third cowboy ran boots, kicking up dirt, hat flying from his head as he scrambled toward the safety of the saloon. The woman stood motionless. Adelaide Harrow, 34 years old, wearing a plain black dress that had seen better days, held a Colt revolver with hands that did not shake. Her eyes, the color of winter ice, tracked the fleeing man until he disappeared through swinging doors. She reloaded. 3 spent shells hit the ground with small metallic sounds. 3 fresh rounds slid into the cylinder with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this action 1,000 times in darkness, in rain, in fear. A child stepped from the shadows of the general store. Ruby Harrow, 9 years old, freckled face, pale beneath auburn hair, watched her mother with eyes too old for her age. "Mama," she said quietly, "you said only if they drew first." Adelaide's jaw tightened. She did not holster the weapon, not yet. Her gaze swept the street, checking windows, doorways, the spaces between buildings where threats might hide. "They did, baby," she replied. Her voice carried the flatness of absolute certainty. "You just didn't see it." The words hung in the air as the sun touched the horizon, painting Red Hollow in shades of blood and gold. 48 hours earlier, the same woman had arrived on a different street in a different light, carrying different hopes. The hired wagon creaked as it rolled into Red Hollow on a Thursday morning in late summer 1889. The driver, a man of few words and fewer questions, pulled the horses to a stop near the center of town. He did not offer to help with the trunk. He had learned long ago that some passengers preferred distance to courtesy. Adelaide climbed down first, then turned to help her daughter. Ruby's small hand gripped hers with fierce strength, the kind that came from practice, from months of holding on when the world tried to shake them loose. The trunk was heavy. Adelaide had packed it herself, choosing each item with care. Dresses for the seamstress she would pretend to be, fabric and thread and needles that would serve as her disguise, and beneath the false bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and silence, the tools of a different trade. "Where to, ma'am?" The driver's voice carried the weariness of a man who had seen too many widows, too many children with haunted eyes. "Miller's General Store." Adelaide pointed to a building across the street. "The proprietor is expecting me." This was not entirely true. Mrs. Opal Miller had responded to Adelaide's letter with cautious agreement to rent the small room behind her store. She had asked no questions in her reply. This meant she had many. The driver deposited the trunk on the boardwalk and left without ceremony. Adelaide watched him go, then turned to study Red Hollow in daylight. It looked like 100 other towns. Wooden storefronts weathered gray by sun and wind. A saloon that dominated one corner. A church that sat quiet and white at the far end of town, pretending to watch over souls it could not save. The mine works rose beyond the buildings, skeletal structures against the mountains, monuments to greed built on broken backs. Ruby pressed close to her side. The child had learned not to speak when her mother went still like this, when her eyes took on that distant quality, seeing through the present into some other time. Adelaide was remembering. 5 years ago, a different arrival. A young marshal with kind eyes who had kissed her goodbye and promised to return in 30 days. Thomas Harrow had believed in justice the way some men believed in God, with absolute faith, with the kind of certainty that made him ride into danger carrying nothing but a badge and conviction. 30 days had passed, then 60, then 100. The official letter had arrived on day 112. Marshal Thomas Harrow was missing, presumed dead, in the line of duty. The investigation into Silas Drummond had been suspended pending further evidence. The widow would receive a pension. The territory extended its condolences. Adelaide had read the letter 3 times. Then she had placed it in the stove and watched it burn. She had placed her hand on her belly where Ruby grew in secret warmth, and she had made a promise that only the walls heard. "If I don't come back in 30 days, Thomas had told her once, don't mourn, hunt." She had waited. Mourned in public while hunting in private. Raised their daughter. Learned to sew because widows needed respectable trades. And beneath the respectability, she had maintained the other skills Thomas had taught her, the ones that kept women alive when the world decided they were prey. "Mama," Ruby's voice pulled her back. "Someone's watching." Adelaide followed her daughter's gaze. In the window of Miller's General Store, a woman stood silhouetted against interior lamplight. Opal Miller, 52 years old according to Adelaide's research. Widowed 3 years ago when her husband had objected too loudly to Silas Drummond's protection fees. The official story called it a heart attack. The unofficial story told a different truth. Adelaide lifted the trunk. It was heavy, but she had grown strong in the years since Thomas left. Strong enough to carry burdens. Strong enough to do what needed doing. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. The store smelled of flour and tobacco, and the particular staleness of hope dying slowly. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with frontier necessities. Nothing extravagant, nothing wasted. Opal Miller stood behind the counter. She was thin in the way of women who forgot to eat, with iron-gray hair pulled into a bun that could have driven nails. Her eyes, sharp as broken glass, studied Adelaide with assessment that missed nothing. "Mrs. Harrow." Not a question, a statement. "Mrs. Miller." Adelaide set the trunk down. "Thank you for responding to my letter." Didn't have much choice. Opal's voice carried the rasp of someone who had screamed herself hoarse once and never quite recovered. "Room's been empty since the last tenant left. You running from something." Ruby tensed. Adelaide felt it in the small hand that gripped her skirt. "I'm running towards something." The words came out harder than intended. Adelaide softened her tone. "My husband disappeared 5 years ago. I'm looking for a fresh start, somewhere my daughter can grow up safe." The lie tasted like ash. But lies were sometimes the skin you wore to survive. Opal's gaze moved to Ruby, then back to Adelaide. Something shifted in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. The particular knowing that passed between women who had both lost men to the same machine. "Safe." Opal repeated the word as if tasting poison. "Red Hollow isn't known for safe, Mrs. Harrow." "Nowhere is, but I can sew, I can work, and I can pay rent on time." Opal studied her a moment longer. Then she nodded, a single sharp movement that meant more than words. "Room's through the back, $20 a month. You keep to yourself, don't cause trouble, we'll get along fine." "I don't intend to cause trouble. Intentions don't mean much out here." Opal pulled a key from beneath the counter. "It's what you do when trouble finds you that matters." The room was small. A bed, a washstand, a window that looked onto the alley behind the store. A single shelf for belongings, a hook for coats. The walls were bare except for a water stain in the corner that looked like a spreading bruise. Ruby explored with the quick efficiency of a child who had learned to assess spaces for danger, for escape routes, for the things adults thought children did not notice. Adelaide placed the trunk at the foot of the bed. She opened it slowly, aware that Opal might return, that walls had eyes in towns like this. Dresses came out first. Simple, practical garments in black and gray and brown. The colors of mourning, the uniform of invisibility. She hung them on the hook, each one a piece of armor in its own way. Beneath the dresses, wrapped in muslin, her sewing supplies. Needles and thread and scissors sharp enough to cut more than fabric. A seamstress needed tools. Adelaide had made sure hers could serve double duty, and at the very bottom, beneath the false layer of canvas that looked like the trunk's base, the true contents of her luggage. Adelaide waited until Ruby was occupied with arranging her small bundle of belongings. Then she lifted the false bottom with careful fingers. The Winchester rifle lay wrapped in oiled cloth exactly as she had packed it. Beside it, her Colt revolver, the one Thomas had given her on their first anniversary. The bullets measured and counted, enough for what she planned, but not enough to be wasteful. And finally, wrapped in silk that had once been part of her wedding dress, a folded piece of paper. The map. Adelaide's hands trembled as she unfolded it, not from fear, from rage that lived in her bones, now replacing softer emotions like grief and hope. Red Hollow spread across the paper in careful pencil lines. 3 locations marked in Thomas's handwriting, his final gift to her, smuggled out through channels she still did not fully understand. Drummond Estate, the mansion where Silas Drummond lived like a king while the town bled. Silver Vein Mine, active, profitable, deadly, encircled in red ink as if Thomas had pressed too hard, as if his hand had shaken Echo Canyon Mine. Abandoned. Beneath it in Thomas's careful script a single word: insurance. Adelaide had stared at that word for months before understanding, before the whispered rumor reached her through networks of widows and survivors who passed information like contraband, before she learned what it meant when powerful men kept insurance policies in places no one looked. Thomas was alive and imprisoned, held in darkness as leverage against federal investigations that threatened Drummond's empire. Alive and waiting. Alive and believing, perhaps, that Adelaide had moved on, had accepted his death, had raised their daughter in peaceful ignorance. He did not know her as well as he thought. "Mama?" Ruby's voice, soft and uncertain. "Are we staying here forever?" Adelaide refolded the map. She tucked it into the bodice of her dress, against her heart, where it would stay warm, where she could feel it with every breath. No baby. She turned to her daughter, this fierce small creature who had Thomas's hair and Adelaide's iron spine. Just long enough. Long enough for what? Adelaide knelt, bringing herself eye level with Ruby. She took her daughter's hands, small and soft and uncalloused, still innocent of the work that would come. Long enough to bring your daddy home. Ruby's eyes filled, not with tears, with something harder. Hope mixed with the fury of a child who had been cheated of a father. He's alive. Yes. You're sure? Yes. Then why hasn't he come home? Adelaide pulled her daughter close, breathing in the smell of her hair, the soap and sunlight and youth that still clung to her despite everything. Because he can't. Because bad men are keeping him from us. Because he's protecting us the only way he knows how. She pulled back, held Ruby's face between her palms. But I'm going to change that. I'm going to make it so he can come home. How? By being what he taught me to be. Adelaide's voice hardened. Strong, smart, and when necessary, dangerous. That evening, Adelaide opened her small seamstress shop. A sign in the window hand lettered on salvaged wood. Alterations and repairs. Reasonable rates. 3 people came. 2 wanted buttons replaced. 1 needed a torn hem mended. Adelaide worked with careful precision, her stitches small, and even her manner quiet and forgettable. She was the widow, the seamstress, the woman who would vanish into Red Hollow's background like wallpaper, like dust, like all the other forgotten people who made towns run without being seen. She closed at sunset, counted the meager coins, placed them in a tin that sat on the shelf beside the bed. After Ruby fell asleep, Adelaide allowed herself the luxury of memory. She sat by the window, looking out at Red Hollow's dark streets, and she let herself remember the man who had taught her to shoot. Thomas had been patient, more patient than she deserved, perhaps. She had flinched the first time he placed the revolver in her hands. The weight of it had terrified her. The knowledge of what it could do had made her want to drop it like a snake. "Out here," Thomas had said, his voice gentle but firm. "A woman who can't shoot is a woman who can't choose. The world takes away enough of your choices, Adelaide. Don't give away this one." So she had learned. First to hold it without shaking, then to aim, then to fire. The progression had taken months, but Thomas had never rushed her, never made her feel inadequate when she missed, never praised her with condescension when she hit her mark. By their second anniversary, she could draw and fire in under 2 seconds. By their third, She could hit a playing card at 30 paces. By the time Thomas left for Red Hollow, she was better than most men who wore badges. "Promise me something," Thomas had said the night before he rode out. They were lying in bed, his hand resting on her belly, where Ruby grew in secret. "Anything. If something happens to me, teach our child what I taught you, that survival is a skill, that strength is a choice, that sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to become dangerous." Adelaide had kissed him then. She had not said yes because she had not believed it would be necessary. She had believed in his badge, in his ability, in the fundamental rightness of what he was doing. She had been young then, naive. Now, sitting in the darkness of a rented room in the town that had swallowed her husband, Adelaide understood what Thomas had tried to tell her. The world was not fair. Being good was not enough. And justice was something you built with your own hands, even when those hands shook. She reached into her bodice and pulled out Thomas's wedding ring. She had found it among his effects, the ones the territory had returned along with their condolences. She wore it on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her dress, warm against her skin. "Still waiting for you," she whispered to the empty room, "just a little longer." The next morning began with mockery. Adelaide was arranging her small shop, placing her sewing supplies where customers could see them when the door opened. 3 men entered, cowboys by the look of them, though the kind who spent more time drinking than working. They carried the swagger of men who had never faced real consequences. The leader was young, maybe 25, with a face that would have been handsome if not ruined by cruelty around the mouth. He wore his guns low, the mark of someone who thought he was fast. Behind him, 2 others older, harder, with dead eyes. "Well now," the young one smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "The widow's open for business." Adelaide kept her hand steady as she threaded a needle. "Good morning. Do you need something mended?" "Maybe." He approached the counter, moving with lazy confidence. "Heard you're new in town. Thought we'd come welcome you proper." "That's kind." Adelaide did not look up from her work. "But unnecessary. Mrs. Miller has been very welcoming." "Has she now?" The cowboy leaned on the counter. Adelaide could smell whiskey on his breath, stale and sour. "See, thing is, Mrs. Miller don't run this town. My boss does. And my boss likes to know about new arrivals, especially ones who come with little girls and sad stories." Now Adelaide looked up. Her eyes met his, and something in her gaze made him blink. "Your boss," she said quietly, "can come introduce himself if he's curious. I don't conduct business through intermediaries." The cowboy's smile faded. Behind him, his companions shifted hands, drifting toward their guns, in the unconscious way of men who had learned to respond to disrespect with violence. "You got a mouth on you, widow." His voice hardened. "Might want to watch that. Red Hollow don't treat uppity women kindly." The door opened. Ruby entered carrying a small basket of eggs from the general store. She froze when she saw the men, her child's instinct recognizing danger even when she did not understand its shape. The young cowboy's gaze shifted to her. His smile returned, uglier now. "That your girl, pretty little thing? Hair like her mama." He reached out as if to touch Ruby's cheek. Adelaide moved, not fast, not dramatically. She simply stepped between her daughter and the cowboy's hand, placing her body as a barrier with finality that allowed no discussion. "Don't." The single word carried absolute conviction. The cowboy's eyes narrowed. "Or what?" Adelaide picked up her sewing scissors. She held them with her thumb on the handle blade, down the grip of someone who understood leverage and anatomy, and exactly where to cut for maximum effect. "Or I'll remind you that needles aren't the only sharp things in a seamstress's shop." Silence filled the small room. The 2 other cowboys tensed, waiting for their leader's signal. Ruby pressed against Adelaide's back, small and warm and terrified. The young cowboy stared at Adelaide. She stared back. Something passed between them. He had expected fear, submission, the 1,000 small ways women learned to make themselves smaller in the presence of male violence. He had not expected this cold certainty. this willingness to draw blood in defense of what mattered. "You're going to regret that," he said finally. But he stepped back. His hand dropped away from Ruby. "Name's Caleb Voss. I work for Silas Drummond. And Silas Drummond don't forget disrespect." "Then I'll be sure to show him respect when he earns it." Adelaide's grip on the scissors did not waver. "Now, do you need alterations, or are you just here to waste my time?" Caleb Voss laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "You got fire, I'll give you that. But fire burns. You'll learn that soon enough." He turned and left. His companions followed, casting backward glances that promised future violence. The door swung shut behind them. Adelaide stood motionless for a long moment. Then her hands began to shake. Not from fear, from the adrenaline crash that came after violence delayed after the body prepared for fight and received only words. She set the scissors down carefully, turned to Ruby, knelt. "Are you all right?" Ruby nodded, but her eyes were too bright, her face too pale. "Mama," she whispered, "why did you make them angry?" "Because sometimes making people angry is safer than letting them think you're weak." "But what if they come back?" Adelaide pulled her daughter close. Over Ruby's shoulder, she could see the street through the window. She could see Caleb Voss standing outside the saloon talking to other men pointing toward her shop, making plans, issuing threats, doing what men like him always did when women refused to comply. "Then I'll be ready," Adelaide said. And she meant it. That night after the shop closed and Ruby slept, Adelaide allowed herself to prepare. She took the Winchester from its hiding place, checked the action, loaded it with careful precision, 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber, 8 chances to end what might begin. She propped it against the wall beside the bed, covered with a shawl that made it look like bundled fabric, close enough to reach, hidden enough not to alarm. Then she sat at the small table and cleaned her Colt by lamplight. The motions were meditative. Remove the cylinder, check each chamber, wipe the barrel clean, oil the moving parts, reassemble, the ritual Thomas had taught her. As she worked, memory intruded. Thomas, 3 years into their marriage, teaching her to field strip this exact revolver in darkness. His hands guiding hers until she could do it by touch alone. "Why in darkness?" she had asked. "Because when trouble comes, it doesn't wait for convenient lighting." She had laughed then, thought it paranoid. Now she understood. Now she could strip and reassemble the Colt with her eyes closed, her hands moving through the sequence with muscle memory that bypassed thought. This was not paranoia. This was survival. A knock at the door made her freeze. Her hand moved to the revolver still disassembled on the table. She glanced at Ruby, asleep and vulnerable, calculated distances, escape routes, lines of fire. "Mrs. Harrow," Opal Miller's voice muffled through the door, "I saw your light. Thought you might want company." Adelaide relaxed slightly. She crossed to the door, opened it a crack. Opal stood in the hallway holding 2 cups of something that steamed in the cool night air. "Tea," Opal said. "Not good tea, but hot." Adelaide opened the door wider. "Thank you." They sat at the small table. Opal's eyes tracked across the disassembled revolver, the cleaning supplies, the efficiency with which Adelaide had prepared for violence. She said nothing, just sipped her tea and waited. "Caleb Voss came by today," Adelaide said finally. "I heard." Opal's voice was neutral. "Heard you didn't bow." "Should I have?" "Most do." Opal set her cup down. "Most learn it's easier that way. Keep your head down. Don't make waves. Survive by being forgettable." "And how has that worked for the town?" Opal's laugh was bitter. "About as well as you'd expect. We're still here, still breathing, still pretending that's the same as living." Adelaide reassembled the Colt. Click, slide, lock. The components fitted together with perfect precision. She spun the cylinder, listening to its smooth rotation. Satisfying. Deadly. "You know how to use that," Opal observed. Not a question. "Yes." "Where did you learn?" Adelaide met Opal's eyes. She saw something there. Not judgment, not fear, recognition. "My husband taught me. He believed women should be able to defend themselves. Smart man. Opal paused. Where is he now? That's what I'm here to find out. The words hung between them. Adelaide had not meant to say them, had planned to maintain the fiction of widowhood, the safe lie that made her invisible. But something about Opal's gaze made Adelaide want to trust. Opal was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured. I lost my husband 3 years ago. Heart attack, they said. Dropped dead in the street for no reason at all. A man of 48 who'd never been sick a day in his life. She stared into her tea. He'd been arguing with Drummond about protection fees, about what was right. I'm sorry. Don't be. Be smart. Opal looked up. Because if you're here for answers about your husband, if you're here because you think you can go up against Silas Drummond and walk away, you need to understand something. What? You can't do it alone. And if you try, you'll end up like every other person who thought justice meant anything in Red Hollow, dead. Or worse. Adelaide holstered the Colt. The weight of it against her hip was comforting, familiar. Then I won't do it alone. Opal studied her. You planning to recruit help? I'm planning to find the people who are already angry, the ones who have been waiting for someone to start the fight they've been too afraid to begin. Adelaide leaned forward. Your husband argued about what was right. You think he was the only one? Opal's expression shifted. Something dangerous moved behind her eyes. Hope, perhaps. Or the ember of rage that had been smoldering for 3 years, waiting for oxygen. There are others, she admitted slowly. Women mostly. Widows and mothers and sisters who've lost people to Drummond's machine. We talk, quietly. We share what we know. But talking doesn't change anything. It does if the talking turns into action. Action gets you killed. So does silence. Adelaide's voice hardened, just slower, more painfully. Opal was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood collecting the empty teacups with hands that had begun to shake. There's a meeting, she said finally, tomorrow night in the church basement. Women who've lost husbands, sons, brothers. We meet once a month. Pretend we're having Bible study. Her mouth twisted. God might forgive the lie. Can I come? If you're serious about this, if you understand what it means. Opal's eyes were hard. Because once you start down this road, Mrs. Harrow, there's no going back. Drummond doesn't forgive. He doesn't show mercy. He destroys completely. And if he learns what you're planning, he won't just kill you. He'll make sure Ruby understands exactly what happens to daughters of women who fight back. Adelaide thought of Thomas locked in darkness somewhere beneath the earth. She thought of the 5 years Ruby had spent without a father, the questions Adelaide could not answer, the nights her daughter had cried herself to sleep. She thought of all the other children in Red Hollow who would grow up the same way, fatherless, motherless, taught by absence that fighting back was not worth the cost. I understand, Adelaide said, and I'm going anyway. Opal nodded. She did not smile. This was not a moment for comfort or congratulation. This was acknowledging the weight of the choice they had both just made. Then I'll see you tomorrow night, 8 o'clock. Come alone. Leave Ruby with me upstairs. After Opal left, Adelaide sat in the darkness and allowed herself one moment of doubt. One moment where she questioned whether this was right, whether Thomas would want her to risk herself this way, whether Ruby deserved a mother who chose justice over safety. Then she remembered Thomas's words. Not the romantic ones, the hard ones. Teach our child that survival is a skill, that strength is a choice. She stood, checked the Winchester again, made sure the Colt was loaded, positioned both weapons within easy reach. She was done being afraid, done being careful, done letting powerful men decide who lived and who died and who had the right to fight back. Tomorrow night she would meet the women of Red Hollow. She would learn their stories. She would earn their trust. And then slowly, carefully, with the patience Thomas had taught her, she would build an army. Not an army of soldiers, an army of widows, an army of women who had nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. Silas Drummond owned Red Hollow. But Adelaide was about to teach him that ownership was different from control. And control was something you could lose in a single moment if the right person decided she was willing to pay the price. She lay down beside Ruby, listening to her daughter's soft breathing in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new moments where courage would be tested against the very real possibility of death. But tonight, Adelaide allowed herself to believe, to hope, to imagine a future where Ruby grew up with a father, where Red Hollow was free, where justice was not just something that happened to other people. Outside, the wind carried sounds from the saloon, laughter and music and the clink of glasses. Red Hollow settling in for another night. Another day of pretending that this was normal, that this was acceptable, that this was simply how the world worked. Adelaide closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids she saw Thomas, not as he was now imprisoned and alone, but as he had been, strong, certain, believing absolutely in the power of one person to change the world. "I'm coming," she whispered to the ghost of the man she loved. "Hold on just a little longer." And in a mine shaft 30 miles outside Red Hollow, locked in darkness that had become his entire world, Thomas Harrow stirred in his sleep. He dreamed of auburn hair and green eyes and the sound of his daughter's laugh. He dreamed of freedom, of justice, of the woman he had married who believed in him more than he sometimes believed in himself. He did not know she was here, did not know the war she was beginning, did not know that the widow seamstress who had arrived in Red Hollow days ago was his wife, his Adelaide, his fierce, dangerous love, who had spent 5 years preparing for this moment. But somewhere deep in his bones, in the place where hope lived, even when reason died, he felt something shift. A change in the air, a promise that the darkness would not last forever. "Hold on," Adelaide had said, and Thomas, without knowing why, without understanding how, found himself believing that perhaps he could. The church basement smelled of candle wax and old Bibles, and the particular mustiness of secrets kept too long in darkness. Adelaide descended the narrow stairs with Ruby's hand in hers, following Opal Miller through shadows that seemed to press close with their own weight. 8 women waited below. They sat in a circle on wooden chairs that had seen better days, their faces illuminated by oil lamps that cast more darkness than light. They turned as Adelaide entered, and the silence that greeted her was not welcoming. It was prey animals watching a newcomer, trying to determine if she was predator or fellow victim. Opal made introductions with practiced efficiency. Martha Quinn, 40-something, with the strong hands of a midwife and eyes that had seen too much death. June Lattimore younger, a schoolteacher whose educated voice could not quite hide the rage beneath. Pearl Chen older than them all, a Chinese laundress whose silence spoke louder than others' words, and 5 more whose names Adelaide would learn, whose stories would become as familiar as her own. "This is Adelaide Harrow," Opal said. "Her husband disappeared 5 years ago. She's here looking for answers." The women studied her. Adelaide met their gazes one by one, letting them see what she was. Not a victim. Not anymore. Something harder. Something that had learned to turn grief into fuel. Martha spoke first. "We all lost people, Mrs. Harrow. Doesn't mean we can get them back. Mine isn't dead." Adelaide's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had stopped accepting comfortable lies. "He's being held, insurance against federal investigations, and I intend to free him." The silence deepened. Then Pearl Chen laughed a sound like breaking glass. "You plan to fight Silas Drummond, one woman with a missing husband?" "No." Adelaide looked around the circle. "I plan to fight him with an army of women who are tired of pretending silence keeps them safe." June leaned forward. "We've survived this long by being invisible, by keeping our heads down. What you're talking about is suicide. What you're doing is dying slowly." Adelaide's hands clenched. "How many more of you have to lose husbands, sons? How many more children have to grow up fatherless before you decide that survival isn't the same as living?" Martha's jaw tightened. "Easy to talk about fighting when you haven't buried anyone yet. I've buried 5 years of my life waiting, I've buried hope every morning. My daughter asks why her father didn't love us enough to stay. I've buried the woman I was before I learned that the law doesn't protect people like us." Adelaide stood. "And I'm done burying things. I'm done waiting for someone else to fix what's broken. If you want to keep hiding, that's your choice. But don't pretend it's because you're smart. It's because you're afraid." The words landed like stones in still water. Ripples of shock, anger, recognition spread across the circle. One woman stood to leave. 2 others looked ready to follow. Then Opal spoke. "She's right." Every head turned. Opal Miller, who had led this group for 3 years, who had counseled patience and caution and quiet survival, stood beside Adelaide with shoulders squared. "My husband died arguing for what was right, and I've spent 3 years telling myself his death would mean something if I just kept my head down long enough, if I just survived." Her voice cracked. "But survival without dignity isn't living. It's just taking longer to die." Martha stood slowly. Her hands shook as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. She opened it, spilling bullets onto the chair. Old ones corroded with age, but still deadly. "My husband kept these, for the day he'd have the courage to fight back. He never did." She met Adelaide's eyes. "Maybe his widow will." One by one the others stood. Not all of them. 2 women left their footsteps, hurried on the stairs, their fear too deep to overcome. But 6 remained. 6 women who had crossed the invisible line between victim and warrior, who had decided that death with purpose was better than life without it. Adelaide felt something unlock in her chest. Not relief, responsibility. These women were trusting her with more than their lives. They were trusting her with their last chance at justice, at meaning, at proving that the people they had lost mattered. "Tell me your stories," she said quietly. "All of them. I need to understand what we're fighting." They talked through the night. Martha's husband crushed in a mine collapse that inspection records showed should never have happened. June's brother hanged for theft when he had been defending himself against assault. Pearl's husband and son both dead within a month of each other after they had witnessed a murder and refused to stay silent. Story after story of casual cruelty, of systematic oppression, of a town that had learned to eat its own rather than challenge the man who held the knife. And through it all, one name kept appearing: Silas Drummond, not always directly. Sometimes through proxies, through accidents that were too convenient, through laws that bent in his favor, through judges and marshals who looked the other way when evidence appeared. As dawn approached, Adelaide laid out Thomas's map on the floor. The 3 locations: Drummond Estate, Silver Vein Mine, Echo Canyon Mine. "I need to get inside the estate," she said. "I need to see his records, find proof of what he's done, learn where Thomas is being held." "That's impossible," June said. "Drummond doesn't let strangers into his home." "Then I'll make him invite me." 3 days later, Adelaide stood outside Drummond Estate with a measuring tape in her hands and terror in her heart. The mansion rose before her like a monument to theft. 3 stories of imported lumber and glass windows and architectural pretension that had no place in Montana wilderness. The kind of house that made a statement, that announced ownership, that reminded everyone who approached exactly how small they were in comparison. A servant had answered Adelaide's carefully worded letter. Mrs. Charlotte Drummond required a new wardrobe. The seamstress was to come for measurements and fabric consultation. Today, 2 o'clock. Do not be late. Adelaide was 15 minutes early. She had learned long ago that punctuality was armor, that being where you were expected before you were expected gave you time to observe, to plan, to notice the things people thought were too small to hide. The door opened. A woman stood framed in golden lamplight, elegant in the way of people who had never worried about the cost of elegance. Charlotte Drummond was 45, and beautiful in a brittle way, like porcelain that had been dropped once and carefully glued back together. Mrs. Harrow, not a greeting, an assessment. Mrs. Drummond, Adelaide kept her voice neutral, respectful, the voice of someone who understood her place in the hierarchy of power. "Thank you for this opportunity." Charlotte studied her with eyes that missed nothing. "My husband says you're different from other women in Red Hollow." "I try to be professional." "That's not what he meant." Charlotte stepped aside. "Come in. Leave your boots by the door." The interior of Drummond Estate was exactly what Adelaide expected. Too much furniture. Too many paintings of landscapes that existed only in artists' and imaginations. Thick carpets that muffled footsteps. Wealth that announced itself loudly because it feared being overlooked. Charlotte led her through hallways lined with portraits. Adelaide's eyes tracked across them with trained observation. Drummond with territorial governors. Drummond with mining executives. Drummond with judges whose names Adelaide recognized from trial records, from articles about corruption, from whispered stories of justice denied. And in one frame nearly hidden among the others, Drummond shaking hands with a U.S. Marshal, not Thomas, someone older. Someone whose face Adelaide recognized from newspaper accounts of investigations that had mysteriously stalled, of evidence that had disappeared, of witnesses who had changed their stories overnight. "Your husband has influential friends," Adelaide said carefully. Charlotte's smile was cold. "My husband has useful associates. There's a difference." They reached a sitting room. Fabrics were already laid out. Silks and velvets and cottons in colors that would complement Charlotte's coloring. Adelaide set down her measuring tape and notebook, playing the role of seamstress with focused precision. "If you'll stand here, Mrs. Drummond, I'll take your measurements." As Adelaide worked measuring waist and bust and sleeve length with professional efficiency, Charlotte watched her with an intensity that made Adelaide's skin prickle. "You're not what I expected," Charlotte said finally. "What did you expect? Someone more beaten down, more grateful." Charlotte's voice carried an edge. "Red Hollow does that to people, grinds them into dust until they're too tired to be anything but grateful for scraps." Adelaide wrote down numbers in her notebook. "I'm sure some people find comfort in gratitude." "And you don't," Adelaide met Charlotte's eyes. "I find comfort in work, in providing for my daughter, in building a life that has meaning." Something shifted in Charlotte's expression. Not warmth. Recognition. "How old is your daughter?" 9. "Mine would have been 20 now." The words came out flat. Final. "If he'd lived." Adelaide's hand stilled. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Everyone dies in Red Hollow. It's just a question of when and how much it hurts." Charlotte turned away. "I need to fetch fabric samples from the study. Wait here." She left. Adelaide stood alone in the sitting room, heart pounding. This was her chance, maybe her only chance. Charlotte had said the study, which meant Drummond's office, which meant the place where a man like Drummond would keep his records, his secrets, his proof of crimes, committed in the name of progress. Adelaide moved quickly, not running. Running attracted attention. She walked with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged, someone who had every right to be exploring. She counted doorways, listened for voices, mapped the house in her mind the way Thomas had taught her to map buildings, always knowing where the exits were, where threats could appear. She found the study at the end of the hall. The door was closed but not locked. Arrogance or oversight, it did not matter. Adelaide slipped inside and closed the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like thunder in her ears. The study radiated aggressive masculinity, dark wood, leather chairs, mounted heads of animals killed for sport rather than food, and dominating one wall, a massive desk covered in papers. Adelaide's hands moved with practiced efficiency. She rifled through documents, reading quickly, absorbing information. Mining contracts, land deeds, letters from politicians promising favorable treatment in exchange for campaign contributions. The machinery of corruption laid bare in ink and signatures. And then, tucked beneath a ledger, a single sheet that made Adelaide's blood freeze. Echo Canyon Mine, holding cell, prisoner maintenance costs. Below it in neat columns, expenditures for food-water chains. Amounts so small they were insulting. Proof that someone was being kept alive barely in conditions that no human should endure. Adelaide's vision blurred. She blinked hard, forcing herself to focus. She pulled out the map Thomas had drawn, compared it to the papers on the desk. Echo Canyon was 30 miles northeast, abandoned officially. But these records showed regular trips, regular costs, regular attention to something that should not exist. Thomas was there. Had to be. The insurance policy Drummond kept against federal investigations that might finally care enough to look. Looking for something, Mrs. Harrow, Adelaide spun. Caleb Voss stood in the doorway. He closed it behind him with the same soft click Adelaide had used. In the enclosed space, he looked larger than he had in her shop, more dangerous. Adelaide's hand moved toward the pocket where she kept a small knife. Not fast enough to be threatening, fast enough to be ready. "I was looking for the washroom," she said. Her voice was steady, a small miracle. In Drummond's private study, Caleb moved closer. "You're either very lost or very stupid, or very desperate." The honesty seemed to surprise him. He stopped studying her with eyes sharper than she had given him credit for. "Drummond thought you were suspicious the moment you arrived. I told him he was right." Caleb's hand rested on his gun, not threatening, just present. "But I wanted to know who you really were before I called him. I'm a seamstress. Seamstresses don't move the way you do, don't throw rocks like trained marksmen, don't case rooms like scouts." He gestured at the desk. "And they don't go through private papers looking for evidence." Adelaide calculated distances. The door was blocked. The window was 3 stories up. Her only weapon was a knife against a man with a gun. The odds were not favorable. "If you're going to turn me in," she said quietly, "do it. But let my daughter live. She has nothing to do with this." Caleb laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "You think I'm going to turn you in, aren't you?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, old creased from being carried too long. He handed it to Adelaide. She unfolded it with careful fingers. A death certificate. Marcus Voss, age 15, died in mining accident Silver Vein Mine, 1882. The signature at the bottom belonged to a doctor Adelaide knew had been on Drummond's payroll. "That's my brother," Caleb said. His voice was flat, empty. "Marcus. He was 14 when he died, lied about his age to get work. The mine collapsed because Drummond used cheap timber supports. 14 boys died that day. The investigation found nobody at fault." Adelaide looked up from the paper. Caleb's face was stone, but his eyes were wounds that had never healed. "I joined Drummond 3 years ago," he continued. "Told myself I'd find evidence from inside, build a case, get justice for Marcus and all the others." He laughed again, bitter. "But I was too afraid, too comfortable, too worried about what would happen if I actually did anything." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're not afraid. Or if you are, you're doing it anyway." He took the death certificate back. "If you're here to kill Drummond, I'll help. But if you're here to rescue someone—" He trailed off. Adelaide finished the thought. "That's suicide." "Yeah." Adelaide moved to the window. Outside, Red Hollow spread like a scar across the valley. Somewhere out there, Ruby was waiting. Opal was watching. The women who had trusted Adelaide with their last hope were going about their days pretending normalcy while preparing for war. And 30 miles away in darkness that had become his entire world, Thomas was waiting too, believing perhaps that no one was coming, that he had been forgotten, that the woman he loved had moved on because survival required forgetting. "Then I'll die trying," Adelaide said. She turned back to Caleb. "But I won't die quiet, and I won't die alone." Caleb studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded a single sharp movement that committed him to something he could not take back. "Drummond keeps detailed records of Echo Canyon in his safe. I can get you the combination, but we'll need a distraction, something big enough to pull him and his men away from the estate." "How big?" "Harvest Festival is in 3 days. Whole town participates. Even Drummond has to show his face, play the benevolent lord." Caleb's mouth twisted. If something happened during the festival, something that required his attention elsewhere. Adelaide's mind raced. A plan was forming, dangerous and desperate, and exactly the kind of thing Thomas would have called reckless, which meant it might work. "I'll need help, people who can be trusted." "You have anyone?" Adelaide thought of the women in the church basement, of Opal's bullets, of Martha's steady hands, of June's educated rage, of Pearl's silent fury. "Yes," she said, "I do." The next night Adelaide gathered her army in the basement again. But this time she brought more than words. She brought Thomas's map. Drummond's records copied in her careful handwriting. Caleb Voss standing at the back of the room like a ghost who had decided to become solid. The women listened as Adelaide laid out the plan, simple in concept, terrifying in execution. During the Harvest Festival, while Drummond and most of his men were occupied in town, Adelaide and Caleb would infiltrate Echo Canyon Mine. They would free Thomas. The women would provide distraction, misdirection cover. Opal would have horses ready. Martha would prepare medical supplies for a man who had been imprisoned for 5 years. Pearl would arrange safe passage out of town. June asked the question everyone was thinking. "What happens when Drummond realizes what we've done?" "He'll retaliate," Adelaide said. "No point in lying. He'll come after everyone involved. He'll make examples. He'll do what men like him always do when their power is challenged." "Then why should we help?" One of the other women, Sarah, whose husband had died in suspicious circumstances. "Why should we risk everything for one man because it's not about one man?" Adelaide's voice was quiet but carried. "It's about whether we're willing to fight back, whether we're willing to say that what Drummond has done to this town, to our families, to our lives, is unacceptable, whether we're going to keep letting him take from us until there's nothing left." Martha stood. "I'm in." June followed. "So am I." Pearl simply nodded. The others, one by one, made their choices. Not all of them. 2 women left again, unable to cross that final line between wanting change and being willing to bleed for it. But 8 remained. 8 women who had lost too much to lose anything more that mattered. "We need to learn to shoot," Opal said practically. "Most of us never held a gun." Adelaide had been waiting for this. She had brought her Winchester, her Colt, the ammunition she had been hoarding. She had also brought patience, the kind Thomas had shown her when she flinched from the weight of metal in her hands. For the next 3 nights, while Red Hollow slept, the women practiced in the hills outside town. Adelaide taught them the basics: how to hold a rifle without fear, how to aim with both eyes open, how to breathe through the recoil, how to kill if necessary, though she prayed it would not be. They were not expert marksmen. They would never be. But they learned enough to hit a man at close range, enough to make noise, enough to be dangerous in the specific way that people who had nothing left to lose were always dangerous. On the 3rd night, Martha pulled Adelaide aside while the others practiced. "You know this might not work," Martha said. "You know we might all die, yes? And you're still doing it." Adelaide thought of Ruby asleep in Opal's guest room, dreaming of a father she barely remembered. She thought of Thomas in his darkness, counting days that had long since lost meaning. She thought of all the women who had come before, who had stayed silent because silence seemed like survival, who had died without ever knowing they could fight back. "Yes," Adelaide said, "I'm still doing it." Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, small and sad and surprisingly fierce. "Good. Because my husband would have loved you. He always said the world needed more women who refused to be quiet." The morning of the Harvest Festival arrived with perfect autumn weather, clear skies, gentle breeze. The kind of day that made people forget temporarily that they lived in a town owned by a man who viewed them as resources to be extracted. Red Hollow transformed. Banners hung between buildings. Tables appeared laden with food that people could barely afford but brought anyway because tradition demanded it, because community required sacrifice. Music played. Children ran through streets that were for one day allowed to feel safe. Adelaide dressed Ruby in her best dress, the one they had been saving, the one that made her daughter look older than 9, almost grown, almost ready for the world that was coming. "Why can't I go with you?" Ruby asked, as Adelaide braided her hair. "Because what I'm doing is dangerous, and I need to know you're safe." "But what if something happens to you?" Adelaide turned Ruby to face her. She looked into eyes that were Thomas's eyes, that saw too much, that understood more than childhood should require. "Then Mrs. Miller will take care of you. And when you're older, she'll tell you everything. About your father. About what I tried to do. About why it mattered." Adelaide cupped her daughter's face. "But I'm planning to come back, with your daddy. And we're going to start over, the three of us, somewhere far from here. Promise?" Adelaide wanted to promise, wanted to give her daughter that comfort. But she had learned that promises meant nothing when the world was designed to break them. "I promise I'll try harder than I've ever tried anything." It would have to be enough. At noon the festival began in earnest. Silas Drummond appeared like a king among peasants, shaking hands, distributing coins to children, playing the role of benevolent patron with practiced ease. His men spread through the crowd, watching, reminding everyone that even celebration happened at Drummond's pleasure. Adelaide watched from a distance. She wore her plainest dress, carried nothing that would mark her as different from any other widow come to observe the festivities. But beneath the fabric strapped to her thigh where skirts concealed it, she carried her colt. At 2 o'clock, as planned, a commotion erupted near the east end of town. Someone had discovered a fire at the old warehouse. Not a big fire, not dangerous, but enough to require attention. Enough to pull Drummond's men toward it like moths to flame. Caleb appeared at Adelaide's elbow. "Now!" They slipped away from the festival crowd, moving through back alleys with practiced stealth. Caleb had horses waiting, 2 of them, fast ones. "Echo Canyon is 3 hours hard ride," Caleb said as they mounted. "We'll have maybe an hour before someone realizes the fire was a distraction. Then we move fast." They rode. The festival sounds faded behind them. The wilderness opened ahead. Montana in autumn was beautiful in a harsh way, all gold aspens and gray rock and sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Adelaide had forgotten beauty existed, had spent 5 years seeing only the necessary, the immediate, the dangerous. Now, riding toward her husband, with her heart in her throat and terror in her bones, she let herself remember. This land had brought her and Thomas together, had witnessed their love, had seemed once like a place where justice might actually matter. She would make it matter again, or die trying. Echo Canyon Mine appeared as the sun began its descent. The entrance was boarded up, marked with warnings about structural instability, about the dangers of entering abandoned mines. The kind of warnings that kept honest people away. Adelaide and Caleb were not honest people, not anymore. They dismounted. Caleb pulled boards away with hands that knew the pattern, that had clearly done this before. "I've been watching this place for 6 months, he admitted. "Drummond's men come once a week, always at night, always carrying supplies down. You knew someone was imprisoned here, suspected, never had the courage to look." His jaw tightened. "Until now." The mine entrance yawned before them like a mouth. Adelaide lit a lamp. The flame pushed back darkness, but could not eliminate it. Shadows pressed close, thick and suffocating. They descended. The tunnel sloped downward, twisting through rock that remembered when this had been a place of hope, of prosperity, of men seeking fortune instead of hiding prisoners. Now it was a tomb for the living. Adelaide called out, "Thomas!" Her voice echoed, distorted, made strange by stone and distance. No answer came. They walked deeper. The air grew colder, wetter. The lamp flame flickered, threatened by drafts that came from nowhere. Then faint and far away, a sound. Not words, just a rustling. Movement, something alive in the darkness. Adelaide ran, caution abandoned. She ran toward the sound with her lamp swinging wildly, with Caleb shouting behind her to slow down, to be careful, to remember that rushing into darkness was how people died. She did not care, could not care, because that sound meant hope, meant Thomas, meant 5 years of waiting were about to end. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and there, chained to the wall like an animal, was a man. He was thin, too thin, beard overgrown, hair matted, clothes that had once been a marshal's uniform, now rags held together by stubbornness. But his eyes, when they opened, were the same. Thomas's eyes, still aware, still fighting, still refusing to surrender, even when surrender would have been mercy. "Addie," his voice was a croak, disbelief and hope and fear tangled together. "You're not real. You can't be real." Adelaide dropped to her knees beside him. Her hands shook as she reached for his face, touching skin and bone, and the proof that he was alive, was here, was real. "I'm real," she whispered. "I'm here. I came for you." Thomas stared at her. Then he started to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just tears that ran down his filthy face while he repeated her name like a prayer. Caleb picked the locks on the chains. They fell away with metallic clangs that sounded like freedom. Thomas collapsed forward. Adelaide caught him surprised by how light he was, how much of him had been consumed by captivity. "Ruby," Thomas whispered. "Our daughter. Is she alive, safe, waiting for you?" Adelaide's voice broke. "We're going home, Thomas. All three of us, we're going home." They helped him stand. He could barely walk. 5 years of chains had left his legs weak, his balance uncertain. But he moved. Step by agonizing step supported between Adelaide and Caleb, he moved toward the exit. They were halfway up the tunnel when they heard it. Voices, many voices, echoing down from above. "No," Caleb breathed. They weren't supposed to find out yet. Adelaide's blood turned to ice. She had planned for contingencies, for obstacles, for Drummond's men pursuing them after they escaped. She had not planned for this, for being caught underground, trapped in a tunnel with one exit and a husband who could barely stand. But even as dread filled her chest, something else stirred. The fierce protective rage that had sustained her through 5 years of searching. If Drummond's men were waiting above, then she would fight. She would make them remember that cornering a desperate woman was the most dangerous thing they could do. She checked her Colt. 6 rounds, against how many? It did not matter. She had not come this far to surrender now. They emerged into fading daylight to find Silas Drummond waiting. He stood flanked by 12 armed men, their rifles trained on the mine entrance with casual readiness that suggested they had done this before. Drummond himself was exactly what Adelaide expected. 50 years old, silver-haired, dressed in clothes that cost more than most people in Red Hollow earned in a year. He radiated power not from strength, but because he had spent decades building systems that made strength irrelevant. "Mrs. Harrow," his voice was cultured, almost pleasant. Or should I say Mrs. Thomas Harrow, Adelaide Cole, formerly of Denver, wife of the marshal who thought he could investigate me and live to tell about it. Inside the Drummond estate, Charlotte stood at an upper window, watching the empty yard below. Her hands still trembled from pulling the bell cord, from calling the servant, from speaking words she could not take back. "Tell my husband," she had whispered. "Tell him the seamstress is going to Echo Canyon." The servant had run. Charlotte had turned back to the window, tears streaming. "Forgive me," she said to no one. But survival had always required choosing sides. And she had chosen hers 12 years ago when her son died asking questions about mine safety, and she had said nothing. Now at Echo Canyon, Adelaide stepped in front of Thomas. Her hand moved to her hip, to the Colt, hidden beneath her skirt. 12 rifles against 1 pistol. The mathematics were clear. "Let us go," she said. "Pointless, but necessary. You have no right to keep him. I have every right I choose to take." Drummond's smile was cold. "Did you really think I wouldn't know, that I wouldn't recognize the wife of the man I've been keeping as insurance, that I wouldn't have people watching you from the moment you arrived?" Adelaide's heart sank. "Charlotte, my wife is many things. Loyal when it matters is one of them." Drummond gestured. His men spread out surrounding them. "She told me about your little visit to my study, about the papers you read, about the treasonous thoughts I could see forming behind those pretty green eyes. Behind Adelaide, Thomas tried to stand straighter, tried to be the marshal he had been, but his body would not cooperate. He sagged against Caleb, breath ragged. "You can't win this," Drummond continued. "Even if you kill me, I have associates, judges, marshals who are far more amenable to reason than your husband ever was. The system protects me, Mrs. Harrow, because I am the system." Adelaide's hand closed on her pistol. She could draw, could fire, could kill Drummond before his men killed her. It would not save Thomas, would not save Caleb, would leave Ruby an orphan. But it would be something. It would be choosing how she died rather than letting Drummond choose for her. Then, from the hills surrounding them, gunfire erupted. Not wild, not panicked. Precise shots that hit dirt near Drummond's men, that forced them to scatter, that came from multiple directions at once. On the eastern ridge, Adelaide saw them, 8 women with rifles spread out, firing with the careful precision she had taught them. Opal, Martha, June, Pearl. The others, not expert marksmen, but close enough, determined enough. "What?" Drummond's composure cracked. "What is this?" "This," Adelaide said, drawing her Colt, "is Red Hollow fighting back." Chaos exploded across Echo Canyon like a summer storm. Drummond's men scattered as rifle fire kicked up dust around their boots. They returned fire blindly, shooting at shadows and muzzle flashes at women they had spent years dismissing as harmless. Adelaide did not waste the moment. She grabbed Thomas under one arm while Caleb took the other. They ran for the horses, half dragging, half carrying a man whose legs remembered captivity better than freedom. "Stop them!" Drummond's voice cracked with rage, with something Adelaide had never heard from him before: fear. A bullet whined past Adelaide's ear. Another struck rock beside her boot, sending fragments stinging against her ankle. She twisted, fired her Colt one-handed while supporting Thomas with the other. The shot went wide, but it made Drummond's nearest man dive for cover. From the ridge, Opal's voice carried clear and strong. "You took our husbands. We're taking our town." More gunfire. Martha's rifle spoke with steady rhythm, each shot the period at the end of a sentence written in rage. June's shots were less accurate, but no less determined. Pearl worked her lever action with mechanical efficiency, turning grief into precision. Caleb boosted Thomas onto a horse. The marshal slumped forward, barely able to grip the saddle horn, but he stayed mounted through sheer will. Adelaide swung up behind him, wrapping one arm around his waist to keep him steady. "Go!" Caleb shouted. He fired his own weapon, providing cover as Adelaide kicked her horse into motion. They galloped away from Echo Canyon with bullets singing overhead. Thomas's weight pressed back against Adelaide. She could feel his ribs through his ragged shirt, could feel the tremors that ran through him, exhaustion and injury, and 5 years of darkness finally breaking free. "Hold on," she whispered against his ear. "Just hold on." Behind them, the battle intensified. Drummond's men had recovered from their initial shock. They were returning fire with the accuracy that came from practice, from being paid to be dangerous. Adelaide heard a scream. Could not tell if it came from friend or enemy. Caleb appeared beside them, on his own horse, face grim. "The women are falling back. They weren't prepared for a real fight." "Neither was I." Adelaide's throat tightened. She had known this was possible, had prepared for it intellectually. But the reality of putting those women in danger of hearing that scream, and not knowing who had made it, tore at her in ways planning had not anticipated. "We need to get Thomas to safety," Caleb said. "Then we regroup." They rode hard for Red Hollow. The sun sank lower, painting the world in shades of blood. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words Adelaide could not decipher. She held him tighter, willing her strength into his wasted body. The town appeared as darkness fell. Adelaide expected alarm, expected Drummond's remaining men to be waiting, rifles ready, vengeance prepared. Instead, Red Hollow was quiet, too quiet. They slowed as they entered the main street. Windows were dark, doors closed. The festival decorations still hung between buildings, cheerful remnants of a celebration that felt like it had happened years ago instead of hours. "Something's wrong," Caleb said. Adelaide felt it too. the particular wrongness of a trap being sprung. She reached for her Colt, then froze. In the middle of the street, illuminated by lamplight from the saloon, stood Ruby, 9 years old. Auburn hair bright even in darkness, face streaked with tears, and behind her, holding a knife to her throat, stood one of Drummond's men. Jesse Kane, the cowboy Adelaide had humiliated with a thrown rock days that felt like lifetimes ago. "Get down from the horse, widow," Jesse called. His voice shook. Fear or excitement Adelaide could not tell. "Nice and slow, or I'll open this little girl's throat right here in front of you." Adelaide's world narrowed to a single point. Ruby, her daughter. The reason for everything. The person she had been trying to protect by being strong, by fighting back, by refusing to accept that evil could win simply because it had always won before. She dismounted, kept her hands visible. The Colt was holstered at her hip, useless as long as Jesse held that knife. "Let her go," Adelaide said. Her voice was steady. "Another miracle. This is between me and Drummond. She's just a child." "Just a child?" Jesse laughed. "That's what makes it work. That's what makes you compliant." He pressed the knife closer. Ruby whimpered. "Drummond's on his way back, wants to have a conversation with you about property damage, about theft, about thinking you could challenge him and walk away." Thomas stirred behind Adelaide. She heard him trying to speak, trying to be the marshal who protected people, but his voice came out as barely a whisper, powerless as he had been for 5 years. Caleb's hand moved toward his gun. Jesse saw it. "Don't," Jesse warned. "I'm jumpy. Jumpy men make mistakes. You want to watch a 9-year-old bleed out." The street remained empty. Red Hollow citizens stayed hidden behind their walls, watching through cracks in curtains bearing witness, but offering no aid. Adelaide understood. They had families too. Threats holding knives to their own throats, invisible, but just as real. Hoofbeats approached from the south. Drummond rode in with 6 men. Not all of them. The women on the ridge had taken their toll. But enough, more than enough. Drummond dismounted with theatrical slowness. He had torn his expensive jacket. Blood stained his collar, though Adelaide could not tell if it was his. His composure was returning, but underneath it she saw rage. The fury of a man whose control had been challenged in front of witnesses. "Adelaide Harrow." He walked toward her with measured steps. "You've been very foolish, very expensive. Do you know what your little rebellion cost me today? 3 men dead, 5 wounded, a mine operation exposed, federal investigators who will now have questions I cannot answer with money alone." "Good," Adelaide said. Drummond's hand moved faster than she expected. The blow struck her face, snapping her head sideways. Pain exploded across her cheek. She tasted blood. Thomas made a sound like an animal caught in a trap, tried to slide from the horse, fell instead, hitting the dirt hard. Caleb moved to help him. "Stay down, Marshal," Drummond said. "You had 5 years to learn your place. I'd hoped that would be lesson enough." He turned back to Adelaide. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to watch while I put your husband back in his hole. Then you're going to watch while I make an example of your daughter. Nothing fatal, just enough to teach Red Hollow what happens when someone forgets how power works." Adelaide's vision blurred, not from tears, from rage so pure it felt like fire in her veins. She had been patient, strategic, had played the role of widow seamstress, had built alliances slowly, had tried to do this the smart way, because Thomas had taught her to think before acting. But Thomas was on the ground bleeding. Ruby was crying with a knife to her throat. And Silas Drummond stood before her, radiating the confidence that came from decades of unopposed cruelty. Smart could wait. Adelaide's hand moved for her Colt. Fast. Faster than Jesse expected. Faster than Drummond anticipated. Speed that came from thousands of practice draws in darkness, in fear, in preparation for exactly this moment. The revolver cleared leather. Her thumb cocked the hammer. Her finger found the trigger. Then a gunshot split the night. Not from Adelaide's weapon, from somewhere behind Drummond. The mine baron staggered. His hand went to his back. When he pulled it away, blood gleamed dark in lamplight. He turned disbelief on his face. And there, standing in the doorway of Drummond Estates' Red Hollow office, stood Charlotte Drummond. She held a small pistol in both hands. Smoke curled from the barrel. "You killed my son," Charlotte said. Her voice was steady, final. 12 years ago, Daniel was 8 years old. He asked questions about the mines, about safety, about whether children should be working in those conditions. Tears ran down her face, but her hands did not shake. "You had him thrown from a horse, made it look like an accident, and I've been too afraid to do anything about it until tonight." Drummond opened his mouth. Blood bubbled from his lips. He took a step toward his wife, fell instead. For a moment, everything froze. Jesse's knife wavered at Ruby's throat. Drummond's men stared at their employer bleeding in the dirt. Red Hollow held its breath. Then Adelaide moved. While Jesse was distracted, while his attention was on the drama unfolding between husband and wife, she crossed the distance between them. Not running, gliding, silent as smoke. Her hand caught Jesse's wrist, twisted. The knife fell from nerveless fingers. She yanked Ruby away from him, pushing her daughter behind her in one fluid motion. Jesse reached for his gun. Adelaide's Colt was already pointed at his chest. "Don't," she said quietly. He froze, hands raised, fear replacing bravado in his eyes. Drummond's men faced a choice. Their leader was down. Their leverage was gone. They were outnumbered by a town that had spent years swallowing rage and was finally ready to spit it back. Doors opened. Not just windows now. Actual doors. Men emerged. Miners who had been beaten for complaining. Shopkeepers who had paid protection fees until they bled. Fathers who had buried sons in mines that should have been closed. They carried tools, axes, hammers. Rifles pulled from hiding places Drummond had never found. And from the south road, the women returned. Opal rode at their head, rifle across her saddle. Behind her, Martha and June and Pearl, all alive, all victorious, all ready to finish what they had started. One of Drummond's men dropped his weapon, then another. Within moments, the 6 who remained were disarmed, kneeling, hands behind their heads, while townsmen stood over them with a tension that promised immediate consequences for resistance. Adelaide's legs went weak. She sank to her knees, pulling Ruby into her arms. The child was shaking, crying, clinging to her mother with desperate strength. "I was so scared," Ruby sobbed. "I know, baby, I know." Adelaide held her tighter. "But you were so brave, so strong." Thomas crawled toward them. His face was gray with exhaustion, with pain, with emotions too large for his wasted body to process. But his eyes were clear, focused on his wife and daughter with the intensity of a man seeing heaven after 5 years in hell. Adelaide reached for him. Their hands met, fingers interlaced. And then Ruby was between them, and Thomas was crying, and Adelaide was crying, and they were together, finally, impossibly, together. Caleb appeared with a wagon. Others helped load Drummond's body, his wounded men. The evidence of empire crumbled. Someone had already sent for a federal marshal, not one on Drummond's payroll. One whose name Caleb knew, whose reputation suggested he might actually care about justice. Charlotte Drummond stood alone in the street. No one approached her. She was both murderer and liberator, hero and criminal. The woman who had stayed silent for 12 years, and then when it mattered most had spoken with gunpowder. Opal walked to her, extended a hand. "Come with me. You'll need somewhere to stay tonight." Charlotte stared at the offered hand, then slowly she took it. Marshal Henry Wade arrived 3 days later with deputies and documentation and the kind of official presence that suggested federal authority might finally matter. He spent a week in Red Hollow, interviewed witnesses, examined records Caleb produced from Drummond's files, listened to stories that had been suppressed for years. The ledgers Adelaide had copied told their own story. Bribes paid to judges, threats delivered to investigators, a network of corruption that stretched across Montana tendrils, reaching into territorial government, into mining operations, into the machinery that was supposed to protect people, but instead protected profit. Wade arrested Judge Silas Thorne, suspended 3 other officials pending investigation, issued warrants for associates who had fled when news of Drummond's death spread. The cleanup would take years, but it had begun. Thomas spent those first weeks recovering in the room behind Miller's General Store. Adelaide and Ruby tended him with fierce attention. His body healed slowly. Muscle had to be rebuilt. Strength had to be coaxed back into limbs that had forgotten how to do more than survive. But his mind healed faster, being with his family. Seeing Ruby grow from infant to child in stories Adelaide told, in memories she had preserved against his return. Learning that his wife had become dangerous in his absence, had learned to be the kind of strong that did not need his protection, but welcomed his partnership. 3 months after Echo Canyon Red Hollow held another gathering. Not a festival, an election. Opal Miller ran for mayor, unopposed. Martha became the town's official doctor. Her midwife skills expanded to include general medicine. June opened a school that taught reading arithmetic, and on certain evenings when only girls attended self-defense. Caleb Voss became deputy, not because he wanted power, but because the town needed someone who understood how corruption worked, who could spot the signs before it took root again. He wore the badge with visible discomfort, but he wore it. Pearl Chen opened a restaurant. It thrived. Turned out that people enjoyed eating food prepared by someone who was no longer afraid, whose fury had transmuted into the kind of excellence that made even simple meals taste like victory. Adelaide never reopened her seamstress shop. She had other work now, work that mattered more than mending. She opened Harrow's Shooting Academy in a building that had once housed Drummond's Red Hollow office. 20 women attended the first class. 40 attended the second. By the 3rd month, she had a waiting list. She taught them what Thomas had taught her, that survival was a skill, that strength was a choice, that fear was just another kind of aim, and you got to decide what you pointed it at. On a clear evening in early spring, as Montana snow began its retreat and the first wildflowers pushed through thawing earth, Adelaide and Thomas sat on the porch of the small house they had purchased at the edge of town. Ruby played in the yard, practicing with the small rifle Thomas had bought her. Not because he wanted his daughter to be a soldier, because he wanted her to never feel helpless. Thomas still walked with a slight limp, probably always would. 5 years of chains left marks that time could not completely erase. But he was strong again, healthy again. He had taken a position as Red Hollow's new marshal, appointed by federal authority, answerable to laws instead of men. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked. He held Adelaide's hand, their fingers interlaced, the way they had been on that night when everything changed. Coming here, fighting, risking everything. Adelaide watched Ruby hit a tin can at 30 paces. The child whooped with delight, then immediately started reloading for another shot. Disciplined, careful, exactly as Adelaide had taught her. "No," Adelaide said. "I regret the 5 years before, when I waited, when I hoped someone else would fix what was broken." She turned to look at her husband, but coming here, becoming dangerous, teaching other women to do the same. She smiled. "That I'd do again. Every time." Thomas pulled her closer. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter grow into someone neither of them had imagined, but both recognized. Strong, fearless, ready for a world that would try to make her small and already equipped to refuse. In Red Hollow lights began appearing in windows, families gathering for evening meals, children being called home. The ordinary rhythms of a town that had learned finally that ordinary was something you built and defended, not something powerful men granted as reward for obedience. Opal Miller walked past their house heading home after a day of mayoral duties. She waved. Adelaide waved back. 2 women who had learned each other's strength through shared danger, who had discovered that the networks women built in whispers could become armies when necessity demanded. "Mama," Ruby called, "watch this one." She fired. The can flew into the air. Ruby turned to them with a grin that was pure Thomas, pure Adelaide, pure herself. A child who knew her parents had fought for her, who understood that love sometimes looked like violence, that protection sometimes meant being willing to become dangerous. As darkness settled over Red Hollow, Adelaide allowed herself something she had not permitted in 5 years. Hope. Not the fragile kind that broke when tested. The kind built on proof, on evidence, on the knowledge that she had been willing to fight and had discovered she could win. Thomas stirred beside her. "I love you, Adelaide Harrow. I loved you when you were afraid. I loved you when you learned not to be. And I'll love you when we're old and telling Ruby's children about the time their grandmother decided one woman could start a revolution." "It wasn't one woman," Adelaide corrected. "It was 8, plus a conflicted deputy and a wife who finally found her courage." "Fair enough," Thomas smiled. "But you started it. Someone had to." Ruby came running up the porch steps, rifle safely unloaded, eyes bright with youth and possibility. She threw herself between her parents, wiggling into the space they made for her. The stars emerged. Montana sky vast and bright and full of possibilities that had seemed impossible 3 months ago. Red Hollow settled into night with the particular piece of a town that had fought its demons and for now won. In the morning there would be work, always work. Adelaide would teach her class. Thomas would make his rounds. Ruby would attend June's school and learn mathematics alongside marksmanship reading, alongside resilience. But tonight, they were simply a family, reunited, scarred but whole. Together in a way that distance and captivity and empire had tried to prevent but could not ultimately destroy. Adelaide had learned what Thomas always knew, that some bonds could not be broken by walls or chains or years, that some promises once made endured past logic and reason into the realm where love lived alongside fury, where protection meant being willing to become the very thing you feared. She had become dangerous for them, and in becoming dangerous, she had discovered she was also free. Free to choose, free to fight, free to build the kind of life where her daughter would never have to ask permission to be strong. The evening deepened. Thomas carried Ruby inside arms that were strong again, cradling his daughter the way he had dreamed of doing during 5 years of darkness. Adelaide followed them into the warmth of home. The house was small, but theirs. Every board paid for with money earned honestly, every nail driven without fear, every window looking out on a town that had learned to protect itself. As she closed the door behind her, Adelaide paused, looked back at Red Hollow one last time, at the lights in windows, at the streets where women now walked without fear, at the church where 8 widows had decided that silence was not survival, but slow death. They had changed this town, not by asking permission, not by waiting for rescue, but by deciding that the cost of justice was worth paying even when the price was measured in blood and risk, and the very real possibility of losing everything. And they had won. Not perfectly, not without scars, but completely enough to matter. Adelaide closed the door. Inside, Thomas was telling Ruby a story. Something about her mother's bravery, her grandmother's wisdom, the legacy of women who refused to be quiet when the world told them to whisper. Adelaide joined them, and as her family settled in for the night safe and whole and free, she allowed herself to believe in tomorrow. The widow's war was over. The family's life had just begun. The end.